The knock on the front door arrived at exactly 9 in the morning, and Vincent Bello heard it from where he had been sitting since well before sunrise. His wheelchair was angled toward the window of the ground-floor sitting room, the curtain pushed to one side just enough to let the street through. He had been watching the neighborhood come to life for over 4 hours. A delivery truck had come and gone from the corner. A woman in a dark coat had walked her dog twice in the same direction. The pigeons on the ledge across the road had reorganized themselves without any apparent reason, and then reorganized again. He had not slept, not really. This was nothing new. Since the injury, sleep had taken on the particular shape of something that arrived thinly and left early, giving way around 3 in the morning to a wakefulness that was not afraid of the dark, but was deeply uninterested in lying still inside it. The medication managed the physical pain with reasonable effectiveness. It did not manage the mind, which ran on its own schedule regardless of what the body was doing. He had stopped trying to outlast it and simply moved to the window, because the window at least offered something to look at, and looking at things was one activity that still felt like something he could do without it costing him. He heard Carol come out of the kitchen and cross the hallway toward the front door, heard the lock turn, heard the door swing open. And then he heard a voice on the other side say good morning in a tone that was level and direct, and not particularly interested in ceremony. He heard Carol say good morning back, and in Carol's voice was a brightness that had not been there in a long time. 2 minutes passed, 2 sets of footsteps came down the hall, one he knew as well as his own name. The second was different, steady, evenly spaced, not slowing near the sitting room door the way people usually did when they needed a moment to prepare themselves for whatever was waiting on the other side of it. The door opened. She came through it the way someone comes through a door when the door is simply the next part of what they are already doing. She was tall and solidly built, with broad shoulders and a way of holding herself that was neither aggressive nor apologetic, just settled. Her skin was dark and her eyes were darker, and they moved across the room in one organized sweep that took in what was relevant and set aside what was not. She put her bag on the side table next to the bookcase as though she had already decided that was where it belonged. She placed a thin folder beside it. Then she looked at him. "Good morning," she said. Her voice had the same quality it had had from the hallway, clear and forward. He said nothing. She introduced herself, Nadine. Just the name, offered without title or credential, and then she was already lifting the medical chart that Leonard Favor's office had sent over ahead of her arrival, and reading it with the concentrated attention of someone who reads documents because they intend to act on what they find. He told her he had not agreed to any of this. She turned a page. She said his attorney had made the arrangements, the paperwork was complete, and they were going to proceed with the initial assessment this morning. She said it the way you state a fact that has already become true and requires no further discussion. He studied her. 30 years in a world where reading people quickly was not a preference, but a survival skill had made him precise at it. Most people, when they came into contact with a certain kind of room and a certain kind of presence, gave something away within the first minute. A shift in their posture, a slight adjustment in how they chose their words, some signal that said they were aware of the weight of what they had walked into and were making adjustments accordingly. She was reading the chart. There was nothing around the edges of that activity to observe. She was fully inside the document in her hands, and there was nothing leaking out, no performance of composure, no effort to project calm. She was simply a person reading something she needed to understand before she did what she had come to do. He found that genuinely unusual. She set the chart down and sat across from him and opened her notebook and told him they would begin with the verbal assessment, 12 questions. She went through them without pausing between them for anything more than the time needed to write down his answer. Pain levels, current and on average 1 to 10. Sleep hours over the past week and the quality of that sleep. Appetite changes in the past month. Medication compliance, specifically the difference between taking doses on schedule and taking them when the pain felt like it required intervention, because those were 2 different things with 2 different implications for how his body was managing. Changes in sensation below the injury level since his discharge from the hospital. History of physical therapy since discharge, whether it was still happening and at what frequency. His current emotional and mental state, asked as a standard clinical item without any extra softness around it to signal concern. He answered each question in a short sentence. Most of the answers were accurate. A couple were in the approximate vicinity of accurate. She wrote everything down without any shift in her expression or the particular careful neutrality that people use when they are politely registering a discrepancy. She just wrote it down and went to the next question. When the verbal assessment was done, she stood and came to stand beside the wheelchair. She said she needed to check his posture and the tension in his upper back and shoulders, which the chart indicated had become a significant issue. She stated this as the thing that was about to happen. He did not move. She said, please, one word, no pleading in it, no managing of him, just the word placed plainly between them. He leaned forward. Her hands were practiced and quick. They moved along his upper back and shoulders with the efficiency of someone who knows what they are looking for and where it tends to be. She asked specific questions while she worked, whether the stiffness in the right shoulder was present when he first woke or developed over the course of the morning, whether the restriction in his neck rotation was there before the injury or was new since. She was building a clear picture of the current condition from the pieces he gave her, without editorializing on any of it. Then she looked at the chair. She examined it the way someone examines something that has been in use for too long without proper attention. She checked the armrests, the cushion placement, the angles of the footrests, and the wheels. The left wheel had been grinding against the frame on hard floor surfaces for close to 2 months, not severely, enough to add real resistance to every push across tile and hardwood, which over time meant every movement through the house cost more than it should, which meant less movement overall. Which was exactly the kind of quiet, compounding loss that took hold without anyone marking the moment it began. Vincent had mentioned the wheel to Georgie twice. Georgie had passed the information along. The wheel had not been fixed. Nadine took a compact tool from her bag and fixed it in under 5 minutes. She also adjusted the left armrest, which had been slowly rotating inward over months until it held him at a compensatory angle that was loading the right shoulder. She repositioned the cushion to properly support the lumbar area. She corrected the footrest angle on the right side. She did all of this without asking permission, without making any announcement about doing it, and without making it into a moment. She saw what was wrong and corrected it and moved on. He watched her. When she was done, she moved the breakfast tray closer to him and said he needed to eat before it went back to the kitchen. She said his chart showed his body weight had dropped significantly over the past 2 months, and his body required the fuel for the work they were going to be starting. He told her for the 3rd time that morning that he had not agreed to rehabilitation work. She said his attorney had agreed on his behalf. Then she added something. She said she understood this arrangement had been built around him rather than with him, and that the frustration that came from that was legitimate, and she was not dismissing it. But what she had read in his chart told a clear story about the past several months, and the trajectory of that story was not going to correct itself on its own, and the reason she was there was to help correct it. She said it without rhetoric around it, just the situation and the intention. He picked up the fork. He ate the eggs, he ate most of the toast. He was not going to examine what had made him do that. The simplest explanation available was that he was hungry and he chose it. She went to speak with Carol while he ate, and through the half-open door he could hear them in the corridor. Nadine built a working picture of the environment through quick, organized questions. What time he typically woke and what the morning looked like. Which meals he ate consistently and which he skipped. Whether there were regular visitors during the week that would need to be factored into the schedule she was preparing. She asked Carol how many previous nurses there had been. Carol told her 3, a brief pause. Nadine said she understood and went to the next question. He noted the pause. He noted that she did not follow it with a question about why there had been 3. She came back and they went through the rehabilitation schedule together. It was not a standard protocol applied without modification. It was built from his actual current condition, starting where he was rather than where a recovery outline assumed someone of his age and prior physical fitness ought to be. She explained each phase and the reason for the sequence so it made sense as a whole rather than being a list of instructions handed from somewhere above. He asked 2 questions, one about the expected resistance levels in the first phase of the exercise program, one about the timing of certain activities relative to his morning medication window, because there was a period of effectiveness he did not want to work against. She answered both precisely. When the second question identified a timing consideration she had not yet integrated, she made a note and said she would adjust. She made the note without any change in her posture. The information had been useful, she had taken it, that was all. Georgie came in at 10:30 with the morning's business. He spoke with Vincent in the shorthand of 30 years and delivered what he needed to deliver and received what he needed to receive. Before he left, he mentioned that the background check on the nurse had come back clean, licensed and fully certified, good professional standing with her previous placement agency, no known connections to anyone in their circles or adjacent to them. He reported this as a matter of standard procedure. Vincent said good. Georgie said going forward, there would need to be adjustments to how certain conversations were handled in the house, given the regular new presence. He said it without elaborating because he did not need to. Vincent told him to handle the adjustments as he saw fit, and that his judgment on the specifics was trusted. Georgie left. Nadine had stepped out before Georgie entered and came back exactly when she had said she would and resumed from precisely where she had stopped. The assessment was finished by noon. She updated the chart. She spoke with Carol about dietary adjustments that would support the upcoming work. She left a written maintenance note about the downstairs railing, which she had noticed on her way in and which she passed to Carol without comment. Before she left, she stopped at the door of the sitting room and turned back. She said one thing: she was there to help him do difficult work that was going to require his genuine participation. She intended to hold him to that participation. She would see him at 8 the next morning. Then she walked out. The house was quiet after she left, the same quiet it always had, and yet it was not quite the same. The usual quiet of the past 2 years had been heavy with the weight of what was not happening, all the activity and forward movement and purpose that had left the building and not returned. This quiet was different, lighter, as if something had briefly opened and the air had moved. That evening Georgie came back and they sat together through a short second session of business matters, and at the end of it, before he stood, Georgie said that the nurse appeared to know what she was doing. He said it without making it a question. Vincent said she appeared to. Georgie said that was a good thing. He said the past several months had not been good, referring to the specific decline he had been observing without knowing how to address, the weight loss and the stopped therapy, and the long mornings at the window with nothing moving forward. He said he was glad someone was now positioned to change that. He said it carefully, because he was a careful man who did not say things he had not measured. Vincent told him he was overstepping. Georgie said yes, probably, he would not do it again tonight. He got up and left. Carol brought the medication at 8 and mentioned that the nurse had also left a written maintenance note for the railing. She said she had never had a nurse leave a maintenance note before. Vincent said nothing. Later, in the quiet of the bedroom, he picked up the exercise sheet from the bedside table and read it with full attention. He read it the way he read things he was going to act on, for intent as much as for content. He thought about what each item was asking of his body and what the realistic response was likely to be. He set it down without doing the exercises. But he left it face up. And in the dark, before the thin and fragmented version of sleep arrived that was all his nights offered lately, he lay still and found himself thinking about the morning. Not about what it would cost him or what it would require, just the morning, the fact of it, what it might hold. That was a kind of thinking he had stopped doing sometime in the past 2 years. He had not marked the day it stopped. But it had stopped. It seemed worth starting again. The exercise sheet was still face up on the bedside table on the 3rd morning, untouched, and in exactly the position it had been left, and that was the first thing Nadine saw when she walked through the bedroom door for the morning check. She picked it up, she looked at it once, she set it back down. Then she said good morning and asked how he had slept. Vincent was already in his chair by the window, dressed, positioned as though he had been there for some time. He had been there since before 3. He had been awake since before 3. He was watching her and he had the response ready, arranged and waiting. The sheet of paper she had left was a suggestion and not a binding agreement. He was under no obligation established by a document he had never read or signed, and he would determine the appropriate timing of any physical activity without external management. She asked his pain level for the morning. He said 5. She wrote it down and began the morning check: blood pressure, shoulder range of motion. The small seated exercises she had introduced 2 mornings ago, which he had been doing because they were sufficiently straightforward to do without it feeling like a concession. She moved through each item with the same organized efficiency she brought to everything, noting what she found and adding it to the chart file. She did not mention the untouched exercise sheet. She did not approach the subject from an angle or leave a silence where it might have been addressed. It simply was not raised. After the check, she opened her folder and took out a different sheet from the one he had not touched and placed it on the table in front of him. She said she had revised the first phase of the rehabilitation plan. She had reviewed his full chart the previous evening and adjusted the starting point, making it simpler than the original schedule had specified. Not because she had reassessed his capacity downward, but because a stronger foundation required more careful building at the base, and she had decided to begin more gradually. She said this in the tone of someone reporting a professional decision made on sound grounds. The first item on the revised sheet was seated arm raises, 10 repetitions. He understood exactly what she was doing. She had taken the untouched exercise sheet and without a word about it had responded to it. She had lowered the first step, made the entry point something a person could step through without having to first decide to climb, and she had done all of this without making any of it a comment on him. He told her the original exercises had not struck him as unreasonable. She said she knew that. She had taken the full picture into account. He looked at the new sheet. Then he raised his arms. 10 repetitions, controlled. He paid attention to how the muscles engaged and where the resistance appeared first. He had not used those muscle groups with any deliberate intention in over 2 months, and they felt stiff and slightly unfamiliar, like tools left in a locked room for a long season. But they moved. The movement was a fact in the room that had not been there the morning before, and facts in rooms, however small, had weight. She made a note in her book without saying anything. He asked about the next item on the sheet. She said they would come to it in 3 sessions. She said it, as she said most things, as a statement of the plan. She explained that the reason was not a limit on what he was capable of, but a requirement of the process itself. Moving too quickly through the early phase was one of the most reliable ways to undermine a rehabilitation program, because it skipped the establishment of the patterns that the later work depended on. She had seen it happen many times, and she did not intend for it to happen here. He considered arguing this. He did not argue it. The days that followed had a new quality that he did not examine too closely. They were still not easy days. Nadine was demanding and specific, and she did not soften a correction or imply that effort alone was sufficient when effort was producing nothing. But they were moving days. They had direction. And direction, after 2 years of something closer to circular motion, had a particular quality that was difficult to ignore no matter how firmly you intended to. On the 5th morning, something happened that was not in any schedule. Georgie had come in mid-morning with documents from the attorney's office that contained information about an arrangement that had been quietly deteriorating for several weeks. Vincent reviewed the documents and gave Georgie the direction he needed. He did this with the measured and controlled manner of 30 years of conducting business, in which emotion was not a useful instrument, and the surface of the response was always the most deliberate thing in the room. Georgie left. Vincent turned from the desk toward the window, and the movement was slightly too fast, and his hand caught the edge of the water glass on the side table, and the glass went off the edge and broke cleanly on the tile floor. The sound of it was brief and definite. Nadine was at the corner desk where Carol had set up a working space for her file reviews. She looked up at the pieces of glass on the floor. She looked at him. He looked at her. She got up, went to the kitchen, came back with a cloth and a dustpan and cleaned up the broken glass without speaking. She deposited the pieces in the waste bin, rinsed the cloth, folded it with 2 precise folds, and returned to the corner desk and went back to what she had been writing. After about a minute of silence, without looking up from the chart, she said his progress over the past 2 sessions had been consistent, and she was moving the second phase of the exercise plan forward by a few days. He said he heard her. She continued writing. That was all. He sat for a moment and let what had just happened sit with him. Not what he had done with the glass, what she had done after it. She had watched it happen, and she had cleaned it up, and she had moved on. She had not made any additional note of it in his file, or softened her voice when she spoke next, or held a careful expression that said she was being professional about something difficult. She had simply been in the room when something happened, and then continued being in the room. In 30 years of working with people who were always watching for something to use, who were always collecting information and assessing advantage and managing how things landed, This was the first time someone had witnessed something from him that could have been used, and had used it for nothing. He did not know what to do with that. He put it somewhere in the back of his mind and left it there. On the 8th night, the thing happened that he would later understand as the true beginning of everything that followed after. He had woken at 2 in the morning, which was not unusual. What was different was that instead of moving to the window, he stayed near the bed. He sat on the edge of it for a while in the dark. He was thinking, without any particular direction to the thinking, about the exercises, not in a planning way, in the way that the mind at 2 in the morning circles around whatever has been occupying it, circling without a purpose beyond the circling itself. He moved to the wheelchair. He positioned it in the open space of the bedroom near the window. He held the exercise sheet in one hand, though in the dark he could not read it. He had been reading it most evenings and he had memorized the first 4 items. He began. He worked through the arm raises, the shoulder rotations, the basic breathing sequence. Slowly, with the full attention of someone who has decided to take an activity seriously and is paying it what it deserves. He was not doing this because a schedule required it. He was doing it because at 2 in the morning in a quiet house, these exercises were the most purposeful thing within reach, and purposeful activity, however small, was better than whatever the alternative was. After about 15 minutes he reached the 4th item, a forward lean with both hands placed flat on the thighs, designed to activate the lower back muscles and encourage the nerve pathways below the injury level to receive and transmit the signals the rehabilitation work was attempting to restore. He had done this item twice during formal sessions. He had felt nothing beyond the familiar tension in his upper back. He leaned forward. He held the position. At the outer edge of his left hip, below the point where reliable sensation had been absent for 2 years, something registered. Not movement, not a muscle contracting or a joint responding. A signal, brief, specific, and unmistakable. The way a radio station that has been static and noise for a long time suddenly, for 1 second, transmits clearly. A single clean transmission before the static returned. He went absolutely still. He counted to 30 in his head. He eased back, he waited, he leaned forward again. Nothing. He waited another 30 seconds and leaned forward again. Nothing. But it had been there, he was certain it had been there. He was not a person who made claims about certainty he did not actually possess, and he was certain. He sat back in the chair and did not move for a long time. He did not know he had made a sound, a small one, not a word, something involuntary. The bedroom door opened quietly and light came through from the hallway. Nadine stood in the doorway. She had come back to the house that evening, as she did several evenings a week now, to update the schedule and review the chart files. Carol had given her a key several weeks before for exactly this purpose, so she did not need to disturb anyone when she worked late. She had been in the downstairs office when she heard something from above that she could not identify, and she had come up to check. She saw him in the chair in the dark, slightly forward, hands flat on his thighs. She did not speak right away. She turned on the bedside lamp, the small one that gave a soft light without filling the whole room. She pulled the corner chair forward and sat across from him. She asked quietly what had happened. He told her. He described the position he had been in and the exact location of the sensation and the nature and duration of it. He described it precisely, the way he described things he needed to be understood correctly, without adding anything to make the account more dramatic or removing anything that might make it seem smaller than it was. She listened without interrupting. When he was finished, she asked 2 specific questions: whether anything like this had happened before at any point since the injury, and whether the sensation had been inside the hip structure or at the outer surface of it. He said no to the first. He considered the second and said it had been at the surface, along the outer edge below the hip crest. She made notes, quite a few notes, writing quickly and without looking up. Then she set the notebook on her knee and told him this was significant. She chose her words with care, in the measured language of someone who did not want to build an expectation that the evidence could not yet support. But behind the care in the words, in the steadiness of how she looked at him while she said them, there was something that was not clinical satisfaction. It was closer to the feeling a person gets when something they have been working toward for a long time makes contact with what it was aimed at. She said he should sleep. She would go back through the nerve assessment records in the morning and revise the plan in response to what had just happened. He said he had been awake since 2. She said she knew. She said she would stay for a while. She stayed for 40 minutes. They did not talk for most of that time. She sat across from him with her notebook, and the lamp made a small warm circle in the room around them, and the house was quiet in the way that houses are very quiet at 2:30 in the morning. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind of quiet that settles between two people who have both decided, without discussing it, that being in the same room at this particular moment is the right thing, and they do not need to fill that decision with words to justify it. On the 10th day, Vincent asked her where she had trained. She was reviewing the morning's progress notes before the session began when he asked it. The question seemed to catch her slightly off guard, though she managed this without showing much of it. She said her initial training had been at a hospital in Boston, and her advanced certification had been completed in New York, and that she had been in private care for the past 4 years. He asked if she had intended from the beginning to go into private care. She thought about the question before answering, which was something he noticed because most people filled the space between the question and the answer with the first thing that was ready. She actually considered it. She said no. She had started with the intention of working in intensive care settings, but over time she had come to understand that what suited her was the full accountability of private care, the responsibility for one person's complete situation rather than for a patient who was part of a larger managed process. She said the weight of that accountability was the thing she found more interesting than anything else the field had offered. He said he understood that. She looked at him for a moment, then she said she was ready to begin the session when he was. He said he was ready. He did not look too closely at the shift that had been happening in the mornings. He did not examine the way he had started waking up before she arrived and finding himself ready in a way that was different from simply being dressed and waiting. He simply paid attention to the work, the way he was paying attention to more things lately, and let the rest settle where it would. He had been in this chair for 2 years. He had spent most of that time looking at how far he had fallen from where he had been. He was starting, very slowly, to look in the other direction. Georgie appeared at the sitting room door before the morning session was fully over, and the fact that he appeared before it was finished told Vincent everything he needed to know about the nature of whatever was coming. Nadine was midway through the shoulder mobility work when Georgie stepped into the doorframe with his particular way of arriving, which was always quiet and always precise, and always carried some additional information in the quality of his stillness. She stopped and said she could finish the remaining items after the business was dealt with. She said it without being asked, and without any edge of inconvenience in her voice. She picked up her folder and walked to the downstairs office and closed the door. Georgie came in and sat in the chair across from Vincent. He said Marco was coming for the quarterly sit-down, this afternoon. He had moved it up from next week without providing a specific reason, just a message through the usual channel saying he would be at the house at 3. Vincent said he understood. Georgie said there was nothing inherently alarming about the schedule change on its own, since Marco shifted things regularly when other matters came up. He said he wanted Vincent to know about it in advance because Georgie himself had not known in advance, which was slightly unusual even for Marco. Vincent said all right. He said to make the room ready. By 3, the sitting room had been arranged in the particular way it was arranged for these meetings. Chairs positioned correctly, documents in their proper places. A certain quality of quiet brought to the house that was different from the household quiet of ordinary days. This was the quiet of a place that was conducting business, the kind of quiet that had a weight to it, and that the walls of this house had known for 25 years. Nadine had been told that the main rooms would be limited for the afternoon session, and that she was welcome to work from the downstairs office or return in the evening. She had said she had updating to do and would use the time. She had not been given any further information, and she had not asked for any. Marco arrived at 3:03. He came in the silver car that he had been driving for the past year and a half, since he had decided that silver suited the current version of himself better than the black that had always been the household standard. It was a small thing. Small things were worth noting when they repeated. His driver parked at the curb and Marco came up the walk with Sal beside him. Sal was Marco's personal man, 32 years old, compact and contained in the way that men in that position learn to be, always aware of the space around him without appearing to be. Marco moved differently. He walked with the particular ease of a man who believed he was exactly where he was supposed to be in any room he entered, which was a quality that could look like confidence, and sometimes was confidence, and sometimes was something else entirely. Georgie met them at the door. Vincent heard the voices from the sitting room, the sounds of men who were family and business at the same time, greeting each other in the shorthand that develops between people who have been navigating that combination for a long time. Then footsteps moved through the corridor. Nadine was at the far end of the corridor near the side table, where she kept her working materials when she was in the house late. She was carrying a folder of updated records and reading the top page as she walked, which was her habit when she was moving between tasks. She and Marco nearly crossed paths at the corridor junction. Marco saw her before she saw him. He slowed. His eyes moved over her with the particular quality of immediate and unguarded interest that he made no attempt to modify when she looked up and noticed him standing there. She stopped. She looked at him with the same clear, assessing look she gave to everyone she encountered in the house who was not part of the household she already knew. Marco introduced himself with the easy manner of a man who assumed an introduction from him was something that would be well received. He said he was Vincent's brother. He said it with a brief pause between his name and the relationship, the kind of pause that implies the name alone should have been sufficient. Nadine said it was a pleasure to meet him, said she was the nurse, and moved on to the side table to set down the folder. Marco watched her set it down. Then he said something to Sal. He said it quietly, not quite under his breath, in the way that men in his world sometimes said things in corridors that they knew could technically be heard and did not particularly mind being heard. It was a comment about what he had just seen, expressed as an observation, dressed as a compliment. It was neither of those things. It was the kind of thing that says more about the person saying it than about anything else. Georgie was at the far end of the corridor, near the sitting room doorframe, and he heard it. He held the door open without any change in his expression. Marco and Sal came through. The business meeting ran for just under 2 hours. Marco had come prepared, which was standard for these quarterly reviews, and he moved through the agenda items with the competence he had always shown in this role. He covered the arrangements with suppliers across 3 cities, the territorial questions that had been developing in 2 neighborhoods over the past quarter, and a financial restructuring question connected to a holding company in another state that had been on hold pending Vincent's direction. He covered all of it well. Vincent acknowledged this to himself, because he had never been the kind of man who withheld credit from competence when competence was present. What he also noticed during the meeting was what happened when Marco moved to the item he had clearly come specifically to make the case for. There was a territory that had been placed in a specific strategic position 2 years before. It had been held in reserve by agreement, a deliberate position that had been reached through careful negotiation at a time when certain pressures from outside required coordinated restraint. It was not an oversight. It was a considered choice made with full knowledge of what it cost in the short term and what it protected in the longer term. Marco was presenting this territory now as an obvious expansion target. He had put together a clear and reasonable-sounding case for it, the kind of case that assumed the original decision to hold back either no longer applied or had simply been forgotten. He did not acknowledge the original decision directly. He positioned his proposal as a natural next step, the kind of thing that simply made sense given where things currently stood. The expansion would benefit the parts of the operation that Marco ran directly. This was a fact that did not require Marco to state it for Vincent to observe it. Vincent listened to the full argument without interrupting. At the end of it, he said he would review the materials and give his direction within the week. Marco said he understood. He said he wanted to make sure the timing was factored in, because certain openings did not remain open indefinitely. Vincent said he understood timing. They moved to the next item. When the meeting concluded, Marco and Sal made their way to the door. In the corridor, Marco slowed. Nadine was back at the side table. She had returned to her records while the meeting had been running in the sitting room, and she was now updating the afternoon notes with her back partially turned toward the corridor, a pen in one hand and the chart open in front of her. Marco stopped beside her. He said something. The words were friendly in their construction and polite on the surface. He was asking how she was finding the work, whether she was comfortable in the house, the kind of questions that were technically interest in her situation and were actually something else. He delivered it with the ease of a man who was accustomed to people receiving his attention as something that was worth receiving. She turned halfway toward him and said the work was going well, thank you, and turned back to the chart. Marco remained beside the table for a moment in the way of a man who expected the response to be different and was adjusting to the fact that it was not. Then he continued to the door. Sal followed him. The silver car pulled away from the curb and moved to the end of the street and turned. Georgie was standing at the front window of the room adjacent to the entry, angled to the side of the glass so he was not visible from the street. He was watching the car go. He had been watching it the way he watched things when he was adding something up and had not finished the calculation. Vincent came through and positioned himself beside Georgie at the edge of the window. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Then Vincent asked what Georgie was thinking. Georgie did not answer immediately. He watched the empty space where the car had been for a moment longer. He said he was not entirely sure yet. He said he needed a day or two with it. Vincent asked what specifically was not yet clear. Georgie said it was several things that individually were not remarkable, and that together were becoming a picture. He wanted to look at more carefully before he said what the picture was. Vincent said to let him know when he had looked at it long enough. Georgie said he would. They stood at the window a moment more. The street outside was quiet and ordinary. The delivery truck was back at the corner. The woman with the dog had passed and was coming back around. The pigeons were on the ledge again. Vincent eventually turned and moved back through the house. He found Nadine finishing the last of her afternoon notes at the side table and told her they could complete the morning session items now if she had the time. She said she did. They went to the sitting room and she ran through the remaining shoulder sequence from the morning, noting the range of motion on both sides and adding it to the chart. He was stronger on the right today than he had been 3 weeks ago. She said this without celebration, just as a piece of information being recorded accurately. He said it was something, at least. She said it was more than something. He did not respond to that. But he sat with it after she left. That evening he sat at the window and watched the street go dark and thought about Marco and the proposal and the way Marco had looked down the corridor when he had first seen Nadine standing there. He thought about what Georgie was adding up. He thought about the 30 years he and Marco had been in this together, the things they had built and the things they had protected, and the particular kind of trust that exists between brothers who have chosen the same world and have stood in it side by side long enough that the standing together has become the foundation of everything else. He thought about all of that and he did not reach a conclusion. He simply noted that Georgie was adding something up, and that Georgie was not a man who added things up when there was nothing there to count. He sat at the desk in the sitting room that evening with a glass of water and the notebook he used for things he was working through, and he wrote nothing in it for a while. He simply sat with it open and the pen in his hand and thought. He was thinking about the meeting. He was thinking specifically about the moment when Marco had been making the case for the expansion, the territory that had been held in reserve, and the specific way Marco had framed the argument. The argument had been smooth. It had been well prepared. It had anticipated most of the obvious counterpoints and had responses ready for them. Marco was not a stupid man. He had never been stupid. He had been, for most of their shared history, sharp and reliable, and someone whose judgment Vincent had trusted in the operational matters that Marco oversaw. What was different about the argument at today's meeting was not its quality, it was its intention. A man who genuinely believes the decision in question is the right one for the overall operation makes his case in a way that incorporates the full picture of the operation. He acknowledges the trade-offs. He presents the downside as well as the upside because he wants the person making the decision to have the complete information. This is what a man who is arguing for a good outcome does, because his goal is the good outcome rather than the conclusion. Marco had not argued that way today. Marco had argued in the way that a man argues when the outcome he wants is specific and personal, and when the person who controls the decision is the obstacle between him and that outcome. He had presented the case cleanly and smoothly and had not acknowledged any dimension of it that complicated the argument. He had not done this because the complications were not real. He had done it because the complications pointed away from what he wanted. Vincent knew the difference. He had known the difference for 30 years. He thought about what Georgie was adding up. He thought about the comment Marco had made to Sal in the corridor, the one Georgie had heard. He had not raised this directly with Marco because raising it directly would have closed the picture before it was complete. He needed the picture to be complete before he acted on it. He thought about Nadine in the corridor, the professional steadiness with which she had moved past Marco's attention, the way she had reported the subsequent incidents to Vincent without any request that he handle them in a particular way. She had simply told him what had happened and had trusted him to respond correctly. He had told her it would not happen again. He had told her with the certainty that was not bravado, but was something earned from 30 years of meaning exactly what he said when he said it. He intended to mean it this time as well. He closed the notebook. He sat for a while longer in the quiet of the sitting room with the painting above the fireplace and the street outside the window. He was aware of being aware of the house in a different way than he had been for the past 2 years. He was aware of its rooms and their contents and their particular light at different hours and the sounds it made when it was settling in the evening. He had spent 2 years in this house not inhabiting it but simply occupying it, existing inside it without letting himself be fully inside it. Something about the past month had changed that. Something about the mornings had changed that. He knew what the something was. He was not going to name it yet, but he knew what it was. He would deal with the dinner first, and then he would deal with what the dinner freed him to think about more directly. He turned off the lamp and went to bed. Marco came back 4 days later without an announced meeting. Georgie met him at the door and asked if he was expected. Marco said he had left something in the sitting room during the last visit, a pen that had been his father's and that he wanted to retrieve. He said it in a perfectly reasonable tone and with a perfectly reasonable expression, and Georgie let him in and went to the sitting room to look for the pen. The pen was not in the sitting room. Georgie came back and said he was sorry but he did not see it. Marco said he must have left it somewhere else and that it was not important. He said he would have a quick look in the corridor where he had stood talking before he left. He moved toward the corridor before Georgie had answered. Nadine was in the house. She was updating the afternoon chart notes in the downstairs office and the door was open. She heard footsteps in the corridor that she recognized were not Georgie's. She set down the pen she was writing with and turned toward the door. Marco appeared in the doorway. He was well dressed and he had the look of a man who had arranged to be somewhere without appearing to have arranged it, which took a certain kind of effort that he had long practice in. He said hello and said he was sorry to interrupt. He had just stopped by to retrieve something he had left. He stood in the doorway with the ease of a man who believed doorways were for other people to feel awkward in. She said she hoped he found what he was looking for. He said he thought he had. There was a pause while she decided how she wanted to receive that. She decided not to receive it at all. She turned back to the chart on the desk and picked up her pen. He said he hoped she was being well looked after in the house. He said it with the word well doing a particular kind of work, the kind of work that a word does when it is covering for what is actually being communicated. He said the house was a big place and that if she ever needed anything at all, she should not hesitate to let him know. He said that he was, after all, family. She set the pen down. She turned and looked at him directly and said that she appreciated the offer and that she had everything she needed for her work. She said it in a voice that was entirely steady and entirely professional, and that made perfectly clear she understood what had actually been said and had chosen what to do with it. He looked at her for a moment. Then he smiled, said he would leave her to it, and left. She heard his footsteps go back down the corridor and heard the brief exchange of voices at the front door and heard the door close. She sat at the desk for a moment. Then she picked up her pen and finished what she had been writing. When she saw Vincent that evening during the session review, she told him about the visit. She described it clearly and without embellishment, what had been said, in what terms, what she had understood it to mean, and how she had responded. She said it the way she reported a clinical observation, with accuracy and without personal distress in her voice. Vincent listened to all of it without interrupting. He sat in the chair near the window with his hands folded in his lap, and his expression was the one he wore when he was fully engaged with information and not permitting anything outside to show. When she finished, he said it would not happen again. He said it quietly, without any additional words around it, just that sentence, placed in the air of the room like something that had already been decided and was simply being stated as a courtesy. She thanked him and closed the folder. He watched her leave the room. Then he wheeled himself to the door and called for Georgie. Georgie appeared from the direction of the kitchen where he had been sitting with a coffee he rarely actually drank. He came in and stood and waited. Vincent gave him an instruction. He did not raise his voice to deliver it. He did not dress it up or explain it. He said what he wanted done, and he said it once, and he said it in the flat, certain tone that meant it was already finished. They were simply arranging the physical details. Georgie said he understood. He left. Marco's driver received the message at 9 that evening, delivered through a phone call that was brief and professional, and that contained everything that needed to be said and nothing else. The driver, whose name was Elias, relayed the message to Marco. Marco's response came back through Elias the following morning. The response was not what Georgie had been hoping for. It was not apologetic and it was not conciliatory. It was the kind of response that a man gives when he has decided, somewhere in his thinking, that a line has shifted and that the new position of the line is the one he plans to operate from. Georgie brought Vincent the response word for word, the way he always delivered information that Vincent needed to have completely. He read it from the notes he had made and then set the notes on the side table. Vincent said nothing for a moment. Then he asked Georgie what he had finished adding up. The calculation Georgie had mentioned after Marco's first visit, the one he had said he needed a day or two with. Georgie said he had finished adding it up. He said that the way Marco had looked at the nurse the first time he saw her, and the comment he had made to Sal in the corridor, and the unnecessary second visit and what had happened during it, and now this response, when taken together with the proposal Marco had pushed for at the quarterly meeting, with the particular framing of that proposal and what it would require from Vincent to accept it, these things together formed a picture that Georgie recognized. He said the picture was of a man who had decided he was operating from a stronger position than he was, and who was testing to find out whether he was right. Vincent asked how he meant that specifically. Georgie said he meant that a man who felt genuinely subordinate did not behave toward someone in the household the way Marco had behaved toward Nadine. A man who felt subordinate managed himself more carefully in the spaces he moved through. A man who did not feel subordinate moved through those spaces as though they were already partly his. He said it without drama. He said it as the conclusion of the calculation, which was all it was. Vincent sat with this for a moment. Then he said there was going to be a dinner. Marco had been asking for a quarterly captain's meeting, and Vincent had been putting it off. He was no longer going to put it off. He would schedule it for the following week. Georgie said he understood. He asked if Vincent needed anything else tonight. Vincent said no. Georgie left. The house was quiet in the way it was always quiet in the evenings, but the quiet had a different texture now, the way the air has a different texture before a weather change that has not yet fully arrived. Something was building. Vincent could feel it in the particular clarity with which he was thinking, the way the mind becomes very sharp when it has accepted that a situation has moved past the point where it can be managed by patience alone. He sat at the window for a long time. The street was dark and quiet below, the same street it had always been, the same city doing the things it always did. He thought about Marco. He thought about 30 years, and the particular kind of loyalty that lived inside that amount of time, the kind that was not entirely about choice anymore but about weight, the sheer accumulated weight of shared history and shared consequence, and the understanding that had grown between two men over decades about what they were to each other and what that meant. He thought about Nadine in the downstairs office, turning from her desk to face a man in a doorway, with no protection around her except her own steadiness, and being steady. He thought about what it meant that she had reported it to him directly, without softening it or minimizing it or asking him how he wanted to handle it. She had simply told him the truth of what had happened and trusted him with it. He had told her it would not happen again. He meant that. He sat at the window until the street outside had been dark and empty for a long time, and then he went to bed. He slept 6 hours, which was more than he had slept in one stretch since the injury. He was still awake before Nadine arrived, but it was earlier than usual that he had expected her, and that was something. The next morning session was good. His range of motion had improved on the left side, which Nadine noted precisely in the chart. He was also managing the fourth exercise item now with significantly less resistance than he had in the first week. She showed him the progress line on the chart, the numbers from the first session against the numbers from the most recent one. He looked at them. He said it was better than he had expected. She said it was exactly what she had expected. She said it without any flourish, just as an accurate statement. He found that, for reasons he did not examine immediately, satisfying. 3 days passed and Marco came back a third time. This time there was no story about a forgotten item and no pretense of another errand. He arrived at the house in the early afternoon with Sal at the wheel, and he told Georgie at the door that he needed 10 minutes with Vincent. Georgie said Vincent was in the middle of a session. Marco said he would wait. He waited in the front room, the one beside the entry that was not the sitting room and that was not set up for meetings. He sat in one of the upright chairs, and he was comfortable in it, the kind of comfortable that comes from a man who considers himself at home in any room he enters. Nadine passed through on her way from the upstairs to the downstairs office. She was carrying the binder with the updated Week 2 progress charts that she had just finished compiling from the session notes. She moved through the front room because it was the shorter route. Marco stood when she came through. He said he had been hoping to see her. She stopped, she looked at him, she said good afternoon. He said he wanted to talk to her directly, man to woman, no formality about it. He said he had been thinking about her since the last visit. He said a woman with her qualities, working in a house as a nurse, was wasting herself. He said he was in a position to make a different kind of arrangement, one that would suit her considerably better and compensate her in a way that the current situation clearly did not. He said all of this in a measured and conversational tone that was designed to make the offer sound like a reasonable business proposition. Nadine stood and listened to the full thing. She did not interrupt it and she did not step back from it. When he was finished, she said, clearly and without any raised emotion in her voice, that she was not interested. She said she was there to do her job was going well, and she would appreciate not being approached in this way in the future. Then she walked out of the front room and continued to the downstairs office. Marco stood in the room for a moment, then he sat back down. He waited for Vincent. The session finished 20 minutes later, and Georgie went to the sitting room and told Vincent that Marco was in the front room. Vincent said to give him 5 minutes. Nadine came to the sitting room before Marco did. She closed the door behind her. She told Vincent calmly and directly what Marco had said and what she had said in response. She said it in the same precise tone she used to report anything relevant to his care or to the running of the household. She did not add commentary to it beyond the facts. She gave him the exact words and the context, and then she stopped speaking. Vincent sat in the chair and looked at her. He said nothing for a long moment. The expression on his face did not change, which in itself was information. He had a particular kind of stillness that arrived when things were being decided inside him that were not being shown outside, and this was that stillness. He told her he heard her. He said the matter was going to be handled. He said she would not need to have that conversation again. She looked at him and then she nodded once and said she appreciated it. Then she left. Marco came in 2 minutes later. He sat in the chair across from Vincent and opened with a comment about the weather and a question about how Vincent had been feeling. He said it with the smoothness of a man who was very good at conducting the surface of a situation, while the actual substance of it moved underneath. Vincent said he had been feeling well. He said nothing else. They sat in a brief silence that was perhaps 3 seconds long, which sounds like nothing and is not nothing. Vincent had operated for 30 years in the knowledge that silence, correctly applied, was more precise than almost any sentence. Marco broke it. He moved to a minor business point and they dealt with it. He raised a question about a supplier arrangement and they addressed it. They were 2 men conducting a meeting and the surface of the meeting was functional and professional. And Vincent said nothing about Nadine. Marco left after about half an hour. He shook Vincent's hand at the door of the sitting room, which was a gesture that Marco had started doing at some point in the past year, and that was another small thing that was worth noting. He thanked him for the time. He said he would be in touch about the dinner. The door closed behind him. Georgie was in the hallway. Vincent told Georgie that he wanted a message delivered to Marco's driver. The message was specific, and it was final, and it concerned the matter of the nurse and what would be acceptable going forward in terms of Marco's behavior in this house. Georgie was to make it clear that this was a single communication, and that a single communication was all there was going to be. Georgie said he would handle it that evening. He did. Marco received the message through Elias. The response that came back, again through Elias, was more measured than the previous one, but it was still not what was called for. It was the kind of response that acknowledges hearing something without acknowledging it as a correction. A response from a man who had decided to receive instruction as though it were a conversation between equals. Georgie reported this to Vincent the following morning, before Nadine arrived. Vincent listened. Then he said that the dinner would take place next Thursday. He said to contact Pete Agosti and Danny Russo and arrange for their attendance. He said to tell Marco the usual time. Georgie said he would. He asked if there was anything specific he should prepare for the dinner beyond the standard arrangements. Vincent thought about this for a moment. He said no, the standard arrangements would be fine. Georgie left to make the calls. Nadine arrived at 8 and the morning session was efficient and productive. She noted in the chart that his left hip mobility had improved by a measurable percentage over the previous baseline. She said it directly and without softness. She said it as a fact being accurately recorded. He asked how it compared to the projection she had set out in the original rehabilitation plan. She told him it was 3 weeks ahead of that projection. He looked at the window for a moment. Then he said he would like to see the chart. She turned it so he could read it clearly. He looked at the numbers. The line moved in the right direction. It moved consistently. It had been moving since before he had noticed it was moving, which was the way real recovery worked, underneath the surface, before it became visible enough to trust. He looked at it for a while. She watched him look at it. She did not say anything while he was looking at it, because she understood that some things needed a moment to be received properly, and that providing additional words during that moment was not useful. She simply held the chart steady and let him look. He said he saw it. She said she knew. 3 weeks had passed since Nadine's first morning in the house, and Vincent had been keeping track of this without acknowledging that he was keeping track of it. The progress chart showed genuine, measurable improvement. This was not a matter of interpretation. The numbers were objective. His range of motion on the left side had exceeded the original 3-month target. The nerve response work was producing results that Nadine continued to describe as significant, always carefully, always within the bounds of what the evidence could support, which he had come to understand was her way of telling him something was genuinely good without making promises she could not back. He had told himself in the first days that any improvement was simply a result of having consistent professional intervention that the previous arrangements had lacked. He did not examine this explanation too carefully because it was convenient, and he let it be. But on the morning of the 23rd day, he felt something that was more than the brief signal of the 8th night. He was in the middle of the resistance work, pushing against the tension band that Nadine held for the left hip exercise, and when he eased out of the hold, there was a clear and sustained warmth along the outer leg, not pain, not numbness, but presence. Actual sensation lasting. He sat back and did not say anything for a moment. Nadine was watching his face. She always watched his face during the exercises, not in an intrusive way, but with the professional attention of someone looking for information that the body reports before the person is ready to report it themselves. She asked him what he felt. He told her. He described it the same way he had described the first one, precisely and without decoration. She made her notes, she asked the specific questions, she checked the chart against the previous nerve response entries, and then she said that this was a different quality of event from the first one. This was not a momentary signal, this was a sustained response. She said what this meant for the outlook. He listened carefully. He had spent 2 years being told, by good and competent doctors, and by people who were trying to be kind, what the realistic range of outcomes was for an injury like his. He had received this information, assessed it, and made his decisions about how to conduct his life in light of it. He was not a man who let hope run further ahead of evidence than the evidence could support. He had seen too many consequences of that particular habit in other people. But the thing she was describing now was not hope without evidence. It was a shift in the evidence itself. He said thank you, he said it simply. She said of course. They moved to the remaining items in the session and completed them. The session was good. He was using muscle groups now that had been largely dormant, and the simple fact of using them, of knowing they were responding, changed the quality of the effort. It was the difference between believing a key might work and feeling it turn. That afternoon Leonard Favre called. Leonard was Vincent's attorney and had been for 20 years. He was a careful, precise man who chose his words with the attention of a craftsman and never used language carelessly. They spoke, as they often did, in the particular way that men in their positions spoke when the call was on a line that might be listened to by people other than the two of them. They discussed certain business arrangements in terms that were accurate and complete, and that would have been meaningless to anyone who did not already understand what the arrangements actually were. One of the things they discussed was the upcoming dinner. Leonard said he wanted Vincent to be clear on the full picture before Thursday. He said it in a way that meant there was more to the picture than the portions they were currently discussing, and that it would be discussed in a different setting. Vincent said he was already clear. Leonard said he thought that was wise. The call lasted 12 minutes. When it was over, Vincent sat in the sitting room in the particular quiet that follows a call like that. He was still holding the phone and looking at nothing specific, turning through what had been said and what it meant and what it did not say. Nadine came to the door. She had been upstairs reviewing his file and had not known the call was over. She asked if the session review could be done now or if she should come back. He said now was fine. She came in and sat across from him at the small table and opened the chart. They went through the day's progress numbers, and she updated the notes, and they spoke about the next phase of the work. At a certain point, midway through the review, she looked up from the chart, and her eyes moved to the wall above the fireplace. There was a painting there. He had always known it was there. He had looked at it many times without deciding what to do with his looking. It was not a large painting, oil on canvas, a landscape with a particular quality of light in the sky that was not quite sunset and not quite afternoon, a specific kind of light that existed only at a certain hour, and that the painter had managed to hold on the canvas without softening it into something easier. It was the kind of painting that was easy to ignore and hard to forget. Nadine looked at it for a moment. She asked if it was his. He said it had been his mother's. She had bought it from a local painter when he and Marco were young. He said this had been in whatever room she considered the main room of wherever they were living, which had changed several times during his childhood, but the painting had always come along. When she died, it had come to him. She looked at it for a while longer. She asked if the light in it was a real place or something the painter had imagined. He said he had asked his mother that question once, and she had told him the painter had said it was a real light, but that you could only see it in the 10 minutes before a thunderstorm arrived from the west, and that once you had seen it you would always recognize it. She turned back and looked at the painting again. She said she could see that. She said the light in it had the quality of something that was both very present and already leaving. He looked at the painting. He said yes, that was what it was. He had known that for a long time, but he had never heard it put that way. He said she was exactly right. She turned back to the chart. The conversation moved back to the session notes and the numbers and the plan for the following week. But something had shifted in the room in the past 5 minutes, slightly and permanently, the way a painting shifts when someone comes and stands in front of it with genuine attention and sees what is actually in it. After she left, Vincent sat in the sitting room for a long time. He did not go to the window. He stayed near the fireplace and he looked at the painting. He was not a man who had recently allowed himself to sit with things that were good. He had spent 2 years making decisions that were management and containment and control, because management and containment and control were what the situation seemed to require. He had not allowed himself to sit with what was actually here, what was actually present in the room on any given day. He sat with it now briefly. He thought about the dinner. He thought about what Leonard had said between the words. He thought about what Georgie had added up and what he himself had been adding up since Marco's first visit. He thought about all of it with the particular clarity that had returned to his thinking lately, that sharpness and forward direction that he had recognized in himself as something that had been absent and was now back. He knew where it was coming from. He was not going to say it out loud, not yet, not even to himself in any direct way, but he knew what the source of it was, and he knew what that meant. And he held that knowledge carefully, the way you hold something that you are not yet sure whether to open or to keep in your hands a little longer, because the weight of it in your hands is itself something worth having. The dinner was in 6 days. He intended to be ready for it. The session that morning had been one of the best yet, not because anything dramatic had happened in it, because everything in it had been exactly what it was supposed to be. He had moved through the full exercise sequence without any of the resistance that had been present in the early weeks, the resistance that had come not from his body but from the part of him that had stopped believing the body would answer. It answered now. Not completely, not in the way it had answered before the shooting, but in the way it answered now, which was real and documented and expanding each week. After the session she had shown him the current numbers against the original projection, and the numbers were ahead. Not marginally, meaningfully ahead. He had said he saw it. She had said she wanted him to say more than that. He had asked what more she wanted. She had said she wanted him to say what it meant, not medically, just what it meant to him. He had sat with this for a moment. He was not a man who was accustomed to being asked for his interior experience by someone who was actually waiting to receive an honest answer. He said it meant that he had been wrong about the trajectory. He said he had arrived at a conclusion about where things were heading, and he had been building his life around that conclusion, and the conclusion was incorrect. He said it meant he had more road ahead than he had been planning for. She had looked at him. She had said that more road ahead required a different kind of planning. He had said he was aware of that. She had said she thought he was ready for it. He had said nothing to this, but he had thought about it for the rest of the morning. It was that evening, while Leonard's call was still turning in his mind, that he found himself standing, in the sense of existing without agenda, in front of the painting for the first time in a long time, not looking at it as a piece of furniture in the room or as an object whose history he knew. Looking at it, the painter had done something specific with that light that was hard to explain, but that was there once you saw it, the way the light was both arriving and going at the same time, both things true simultaneously. He thought this was not the worst description of where he was. He thought about the dinner, about what it was going to contain. He had a clear picture now of what was in the room that was not being said, and the picture was not comfortable, but it was clear, and clarity was always preferable to the alternative. He had a clear picture of other things too, things that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with the past 6 weeks and what those weeks had contained. He was not going to run the calculation in any formal way. He was simply aware of what was true, and was choosing to be aware of it without flinching from it, or making more of it than it was ready to be. The dinner was in 4 days. He would deal with what the dinner held, and then, after that, he would deal with what came after the dinner. He had more road ahead. He intended to use it well. The house was being prepared for the dinner when something went quiet in it that was not supposed to go quiet. Carol had arranged the help for the evening, and the dining room had been set up by mid-afternoon. The table was correct, the chairs positioned, the specific items placed in the right places that made this room become what it became on these evenings. There was a particular kind of attention that went into preparing a house like this for the men who were going to sit in it, and Carol had been doing it for a long time, and she knew how to do it correctly. By 5 in the evening the house was ready. Vincent had dressed early and had been in the sitting room since 4, in his good jacket, the dark one that Leonard had once described as the only jacket in the city that made a man in a wheelchair look like the most powerful person in the room. Leonard had meant it as a compliment, and it was one. Vincent had worn it to every significant meeting of the past 2 years. Pete Agosti arrived first, at 6:15, which was 15 minutes ahead of the called time, which was Pete's way of demonstrating that he paid attention to things. Pete was 51, with a square jaw and the kind of unhurried manner that comes from 20 years of making decisions in rooms where the wrong decision had irreversible consequences. He greeted Vincent with the particular warmth and respect that was genuine and not performed, the kind that comes from a long shared history rather than from calculation. Danny Russo came 10 minutes later. Danny was 47 and rangy, with quick eyes, and a way of sitting in a chair that suggested he was always ready to stand up quickly if something required it. He had been at the dinner table in this house more times than he could count, and he took his seat with the ease of a man who is familiar with the room. Two others came in the following minutes, men who held positions in the network that required their presence at this kind of table. Georgie served as the household anchor for the evening. He moved through the preparation with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done this many times and who trusted the house to hold what it was designed to hold. Nadine had been told, as she always was for evenings like this, that the house would be running differently and that she was welcome to finish early or to work from the office if she needed to complete anything for the following day's session. She had said she had a few things to update and would use the downstairs office for an hour before leaving. Marco arrived at 7:12, which was 12 minutes late. He came in with Sal. He was dressed well and he greeted Pete and Danny and the others at the table with the ease of a man who moved between different rooms of power and was comfortable in all of them. He sat in his chair. He poured his own water. He had the particular look of a man who is at a table he considers himself to belong to. The dinner began. The food was good and the conversation moved through its usual channels. Business that needed to be acknowledged at a gathering like this was acknowledged. Items that required direction were given direction. The tone at the table was the professional and measured tone that these men brought to these evenings, which was not casual but was not tense, which was simply the register of people who had been doing this for long enough that the formality was now their natural mode. Marco was slightly off. Not dramatically, not visibly to someone who was not paying attention, but Pete noticed it because Pete paid attention to everything, and Georgie noticed it standing near the door of the dining room because Georgie paid attention to everything, and Vincent noticed it because he had known Marco for all of his 52 years and he knew every variation of how Marco sat in a room. Marco was slightly too comfortable. He was sitting at the table with the ease of a man who had already arranged the outcome of the evening in his mind, and was now simply waiting for the events to arrive at the place he had already put them. The dinner moved through its portions. At a point between the main course and the end of the evening, when the table was in a period of easier conversation, and the formal portion of the meeting had concluded, the door between the dining room and the corridor leading to the kitchen opened slightly. Nadine came through it, carrying a folder of papers she had just collected from the downstairs office to take home for the evening review. She had intended to leave through the back of the house, through the kitchen, so as not to move through the dining room while the dinner was running. She had gotten the routes slightly confused in the back half of the house, which was a part of the building she was less familiar with, and she came through the wrong door. She saw the men at the table. She stopped. She was in the doorway for perhaps 3 seconds, long enough to recognize she was in the wrong place, and she began to move back. Marco spoke. He said something in a voice that was loud enough to be heard by every person at the table. The specific words were a comment about her appearance. They were said in the familiar and dismissive tone of a man who was displaying something to an audience, using another person as the material for that display. There was laughter from one person at the table, a half-second of uncertain sound from someone who was reacting before they had decided how to react, and then immediately after the laughter, a silence. The silence was the room understanding what had just happened. Pete looked immediately at Vincent. Nadine was still in the doorway. Her face had the very still quality of a person who has just received something they did not expect and who is deciding, in real time, how to hold it. Vincent did not look at Marco. He looked at Nadine. He looked at her for 1 full second. Then he put his hands on the wheels of his chair. He moved across the dining room. He crossed the full length of the table, which took him past the chairs of Pete and Danny and the others, and he did it without any apparent hurry and without any apparent emotion visible on his face. The room watched him move. Nobody said anything. The only sound was the quiet rolling of the wheels on the floor. He stopped in front of Marco. Marco had not moved from his chair. He had the particular stillness of a man who has made a mistake and has not yet decided how large the mistake is. Vincent raised his right hand and he struck Marco across the face with the open palm of it. It was not a small gesture. It was sharp and deliberate, and it connected with a sound that was audible in every corner of the room. Marco went sideways in his chair. The silence that followed was unlike any silence the room had contained before. It was the silence of something that could not be unsaid. of a line that had been drawn in a place that everyone present now understood. Vincent looked at Marco. He said one sentence. He said it in a low voice that carried to every part of the room without any effort, and that did not require repetition. He said that a man who could not control himself in his own brother's house did not belong at any table that his brother was sitting at. Marco put his hand to his face. He looked up at Vincent. In Marco's eyes was something complex, the compound of anger and something else, something that looked very much like the recognition of a calculation that had turned out to be wrong. Vincent turned the chair. He moved back to his place at the head of the table. He sat there. The room held its breath for a long moment, and then Pete Agosti, who was the most experienced man at the table and who understood what had just happened better than anyone else present, picked up the water glass in front of him and set it down and looked straight ahead, which was the signal that the situation had been addressed and the evening would now proceed. Nobody looked at Marco. The door to the corridor was closed. Nadine was no longer in the doorway. In the silence that followed, the room held itself very carefully. Pete Agosti sat with his hands folded on the table and his eyes forward. He was not a man who showed much on his face during significant moments. He had learned that the face during a significant moment was itself a communication, and that what he communicated in these moments was that the situation was being received and processed, and that he, as one of the senior men at this table, was doing what a senior man was supposed to do, which was to hold the room steady. Danny Russo was looking at the tablecloth. His hands were flat on the surface beside his plate. He was not looking at Vincent, and he was not looking at where Marco had been sitting. He was looking at the tablecloth with the focused attention of a man who is working very hard to be very still. The others at the table had the specific quality of people who have just witnessed something they will never discuss in any room other than the ones where it is absolutely necessary to discuss it. They had not moved. They were not going to move until someone told them what came next. Vincent looked at each of them. He said the evening was complete. He said they would be in touch through the normal channels. He said he appreciated their attendance. He turned the chair. He positioned it at the head of the table, in the way he had been positioned at the beginning of the evening. He said one thing more. He said that what they had witnessed tonight was a matter of the house. He said it was handled. He said no additional discussion about it was needed or expected beyond these walls, and that this was not a request. He said good night. People moved. They moved in the careful and measured way that people move when they have just been through something significant, and they are choosing, deliberately and correctly, to let the person who is responsible for the room finish what they are doing before the room releases them. They filed out. Georgie held the door. Each man said good night. Pete last stopped at the door. He looked at Vincent for a moment. He did not say anything. He simply held the look for a second, the specific look of a man who has watched someone do the right thing and wanted them to know it had been witnessed by the right pair of eyes. Then he left. The dining room was empty except for Vincent and Georgie. Georgie said he would go check on the kitchen. Vincent said he would go to the sitting room. He moved through the house. The hall was quiet, the rooms were quiet, the particular quiet that a house holds after people have left. It was settling through everything. He came to the sitting room and positioned himself near the window and looked out at the street. He had just struck his brother at his own table. He sat with this. He did not rush past it or push it away. He let it be exactly what it was, which was significant and was necessary and was also, underneath the necessity, a grief, because it was his brother. Whatever Marco had become in recent months, and whatever it had required tonight, he was still his brother, and 30 years did not stop being 30 years just because they had arrived here. He sat with all of it, the grief and the clarity together. They were not in conflict, they simply both lived in the same room. He heard footsteps in the hall. Sal helped Marco out of the chair. This happened quickly and without drama, Sal's hands under Marco's arms and Marco finding his feet, and the two of them moving toward the far side of the room in a way that was almost choreographed, as though they had both understood what was going to be required of them in the next 30 seconds, even before it became required. Marco stood at the far end of the dining room with Sal beside him. There was blood on his lower lip. He was holding his face with one hand, and looking at Vincent with an expression that had moved past the anger it had begun with into something more measured, the expression of a man who is conducting a rapid internal assessment of the situation he currently occupies. Vincent sat at the head of the table. He had positioned the chair as it was usually positioned for these dinners, centered, forward, the posture of a man who is where he belongs. He was looking at Marco. He said, in the same quiet and carrying voice he had used before, that Marco would be taken home now. He said that Sal would arrange this. He said that Marco would be in touch with Leonard Favre by 9 the following morning, and that Leonard would have certain things to communicate to him, which Marco was expected to receive and acknowledge. He said this was a family matter that would be resolved through the appropriate channels, and that the evening was now over. Marco said nothing. There was a moment in which something seemed to be moving behind his eyes, some response forming, some argument or counter that was being assembled, and then it stopped. He took his hand away from his face. He looked at Pete and then at Danny and then back at Vincent. Whatever he had been considering saying did not come. He turned and went toward the door with Sal. Georgie was there to hold it open. They left. The room was silent for a few seconds after the door closed. Pete sat at his place with his hands folded on the table. Danny was looking at the wall. The others held their positions. Nobody said anything, which was itself a form of acknowledgement. These were men who understood what had just occurred. They understood it with the full precision of people who had spent their professional lives in environments where actions at a table carried meaning beyond the action itself. Pete turned his head toward Vincent. He said in a quiet voice that the evening had been conducted with the full authority of the house, and that whatever needed to follow from it would follow in the appropriate way. He said this as a man who was both expressing support and transmitting information to the others at the table about how they were expected to process what they had witnessed. Vincent acknowledged this with a brief nod. The dinner ended within the next 20 minutes. People left in the order that people always left from these gatherings, with a certain protocol to the departures that had nothing to do with emotion and everything to do with the structure of how the house operated. Pete was the last of the guests to go. He shook Vincent's hand at the door of the dining room and said nothing else and left. Georgie stood in the hallway after the door closed. He looked at Vincent. Vincent said to give him a few minutes. He went to the sitting room and positioned himself near the window. The house was very quiet now. The sounds of the clearing after a dinner, Carol moving in the kitchen, the soft sounds of the house managing itself, were the only things present. From outside, through the window, the street was doing what it did, indifferent and continuous. Georgie went to the kitchen to check on Carol. He found Nadine there. She was standing at the kitchen counter with her folder still in her hands, the one she had been carrying when she had come through the wrong door. She was looking at the countertop. Her hands were steady. Carol was on the far side of the kitchen near the sink, pale and very quiet, doing something with the cups that did not require her full attention but was giving her hands something to do. Georgie came in and stood near Nadine. He said that she should know Vincent had handled the situation and that it would not arise again. He said it carefully and without expanding on what that meant in practical terms, because he did not need to expand on it. She looked at him. She asked if Vincent was all right. Georgie said he was. He said Vincent was in the sitting room. She stood at the counter for another moment. Then she set the folder down on the counter and said she would go see him before she left. Georgie said that was probably the right thing. She went through the kitchen door toward the hallway and then to the sitting room. The door was slightly open. She pushed it further and came in. Vincent was at the window, the curtain pulled to the side the same way it was every morning, looking at the street. He was in his good jacket still, the dark one that suited him. He turned when he heard the door. She came and sat in the chair across from where he was parked at the window, not the clinical chair, the one she used during assessments, the sitting chair, the one that guests used. She put her hands in her lap and looked at him. She asked how he was. He said he was fine. She said she wanted to thank him for what he had done. She said it plainly without any additional words around it, just the gratitude stated clearly and without performance. He said she did not need to thank him. She said she did and she had. They sat for a moment. The room was quiet the way it was quiet in the evenings now, a quality of quiet that had become familiar, and that was different from the heavy quiet it had been before she had started coming. She asked him something she had been holding since she had watched him cross the length of the dining room in his chair. She asked why, not why he had done it because she understood why he had done it. She asked why in front of everyone. He looked at her. He said because Marco had done what he did in front of everyone. She absorbed this. He said there was a principle that had governed how he had operated for 30 years, which was that a thing done in public required a response in public. Not because of the spectacle of it, but because the witnesses to the original act needed to see what it had produced. He said if he had handled it privately, Marco would have found a way to present the private handling to the world as something other than what it was. He said he did not permit the reframing of things that happened in his house. She said she understood. He said he also wanted her to know something separate from that. He said that what Marco had done had nothing to do with any business calculation or any strategic positioning. It was simply wrong, and he had wanted her to see that he knew it was wrong and that he was not willing to let it stand, and that the room was going to know that too. She looked at him for a long time without speaking. Then she said that in 4 years of private care work she had been in a number of households. She had been treated well and she had been treated badly, and she had been treated with various grades of decent and indifferent. She had managed all of it. She said she had never had anyone act on her behalf the way he had acted tonight. He said nothing to this, he simply looked back at her. She did not wipe her eyes, they were dry, but something in her face had changed in the way that a face changes when something it has been holding settles. She stayed for 2 hours, past the time she should have left. They talked about things that were not medical and were not business. She asked about certain objects in the sitting room, and he told her where they had come from. He asked about her work before the current placement, and she told him about a case that had been particularly difficult and what she had learned from it. They talked with the ease of 2 people who had gotten past the stage of having to arrange themselves for each other and had arrived at the stage where the arrangement was simply how they naturally sat. At some point the talking stopped and they just stayed in the room together, and the staying was enough. She said good night when she finally stood. She said she would see him at 8. He said good night. She left. He sat alone at the window for a while after she went out. The street outside was dark and quiet. He was tired in a way that was not the grinding tiredness of the past 2 years. It was the cleaner kind of tired that comes after something significant has been done, and the day has fully spent itself. He went to bed at midnight. He slept without waking until 6. He had not done that in 2 years. He lay in the morning light for a while before moving, aware of something that it took him a moment to name. He was not accustomed to naming it, because it was not something he had allowed himself to experience with any regularity in recent times. He was looking forward to the morning. He sat at the window and he did not know how long he had been sitting there. The street outside had moved through its night rhythms. A car came and went. A light in a window across the road went off. The ordinary activity of an ordinary night, in a city that kept moving regardless of what happened inside particular houses on particular streets. He thought about what Nadine had said, that in 4 years of private care work, she had never had anyone act on her behalf the way he had acted tonight. He thought about what this meant. He was a man who had spent 30 years acting on behalf of things and people and arrangements. He had acted on behalf of the family, on behalf of the structure, on behalf of specific people in specific moments when those specific people needed something done, and he was the person in the position to do it. All of this was true and all of it mattered. But what he had done tonight was different from all of those things. He had crossed the length of that room because the thing that had happened was wrong, and because the person it had happened to was someone he was not willing to have it happen to. Not because of strategy, not because of structure, because of who she was and what she was worth and what he felt about both of those things. He had not crossed a room that way in a very long time. He had not felt something with that particular quality and that particular certainty in a very long time. He sat at the window and the city ran outside it, and inside the house the quiet was the full quiet of late evening, and he was in it without needing it to be other than it was. He thought about the next morning. He thought about 8 o'clock. He did not think about it as a problem or a complication or a thing to be managed. He simply thought about it the way you think about a morning that has something good in it. He went to bed at midnight. He slept without waking until 6 in the morning, which had not happened once in the 2 years since the shooting. He lay in the morning light and he was aware of it. The light, the fact of the morning, the particular quality of a day that had not yet been decided. He lay there for a while and let the morning be around him without moving into it yet. Then he moved into it. He dressed, he positioned himself at the window. He watched the street come to life in the way it always came to life, the delivery truck and the woman with the dog and the pigeons. He watched the end of the street for the car he had been watching for each morning for 6 weeks. He saw it. He turned back toward the door. Georgie was at the door of the sitting room at 7 in the morning, before Nadine arrived and before Carol had finished in the kitchen. He had the particular look that he carried when information had come in during the night, and the information was the kind that required Vincent's attention before the regular day could begin. It was not alarm. Georgie did not carry alarm in his face. It was the specific quality of a man who had been doing a job for 30 years, and who knew the difference between news that could wait and news that could not, and this was news that could not. Vincent was already in his chair near the window. He had slept 6 hours the night before and woken at 5, which was earlier than the 6 o'clock he had managed the past 2 mornings, but still better than what the nights had looked like a month ago. He was dressed and alert when Georgie came in, and he told Georgie to sit down and tell him. Georgie sat. He said that word of Thursday evening had moved through the network. This was expected. These things always moved, and the speed at which they moved said something about how the event had been received by the people it reached. The specific thing Georgie had come to report was this: a man named Burke had sent a message. Burke ran an operation in the northern end of the city that had been running in parallel to Vincent's interests for about 8 years, not always comfortably, but within the terms of an arrangement that had been established and renewed a number of times. Burke was not a foolish man, but Burke was an opportunistic one. He had been in the habit over the years of testing the edges of situations when he thought the edges were soft. The message was not direct. It came through 2 layers of intermediary, the way these things were always sent when the sender did not want their name on the opening move. What it communicated, in the indirect language that was used for this kind of communication, was a question about the current management structure on Vincent's side. Whether the recent event at the dinner table was indicative of instability, whether certain arrangements that had been in place might be worth revisiting. It was a probe, clean, professional, and carefully insulated from direct attribution. Georgie explained all of this in the precise and abbreviated way he explained things, giving Vincent the full picture without unnecessary words around it. Vincent listened without interrupting. When Georgie was done, he asked one question. He asked whether Burke's message had come through Elia's, which would mean it had come through Marco's network before it came to them. Georgie said no, it had come through a different channel, one of Burke's own people. Vincent considered this. He said it meant Burke was acting on his own intelligence, not on information fed to him from inside. He said this was actually a useful data point about the limits of what Marco had shared with the outside. He said he wanted Georgie to relay a response to Burke through Leonard Favre. He said the response would be delivered in a specific way, through a formal channel, which was itself information because it said something about the kind of response Burke was getting. He told Georgie exactly what the response should say. It was not a threat, it was not a confrontation. It was a very precise statement of the current operational facts, delivered in language that left no room for interpretation, that closed every ambiguity that Burke had been attempting to probe, and that demonstrated, in the specific and undeniable way that only accurate information delivered with complete authority can demonstrate, that the management structure on Vincent's side of the arrangement was in full working order, and that Burke's assessment of the situation had been incorrect. He said all of this to Georgie in about 4 minutes. Georgie took his notes. He said he would have it to Leonard before 9. He left. Vincent sat at the window after Georgie went and thought about Burke. He had known Burke for 8 years and understood him the way you understand a person who operates by a consistent logic, which was that any sign of weakness was an invitation, and any demonstrated strength was a boundary. Burke would receive the response, and he would read it correctly, and he would not send another probe. This turned out to be exactly what happened. The response was delivered through Leonard that morning, and by the afternoon Georgie had word that Burke had received it. There was no follow-up message. There was nothing but the silence of a man who had tested something and found it solid and had moved his attention elsewhere. The thing that interested Vincent about the whole sequence was not the probe itself. Probes were a fact of the world he operated in. What interested him was how he had handled it. He had sat in this room in this chair, and he had thought through the situation clearly and precisely, and he had given Georgie exactly the right instruction, and the instruction had produced exactly the right result. He had not needed to move from this room to do it. He had not needed anything other than his mind and Georgie and the telephone. His mind had not been injured in the shooting. He had spent 2 years operating as though it had, which was a mistake he was now recognizing the full size of. Nadine arrived at 8. She came through the door with the same even energy she always brought, set her bag on the side table and looked at him. She said he seemed different this morning. He said it had been a productive morning already. She asked what that meant, but she said it with a slight note in her voice that said she suspected it meant something she did not need the full details of. He said it meant the situation had been handled and the house was in order and they could proceed with the session. She said all right. The session was excellent. He moved through the full range of the current exercise program with a quality of engagement that she noted precisely in the chart, writing the numbers with the expression of someone who is recording something genuinely satisfying to record. At the end of the session, she showed him the 6-week progress line on the chart. The line was unmistakable. It went in one direction. He looked at it for a moment, and then he said he wanted to know the realistic projection for the next 3 months, if the current trajectory held. She told him. He absorbed what she said. He looked at the chart and then at the window. He said he had not allowed himself to think in 3-month terms for a while. She said she knew. She said she thought he was ready to start. He said he thought so too. After the session, Nadine went to the downstairs office to update the files. She sat at the desk and opened the chart and began the update notes. She was through the first half of them when she stopped writing and sat back in the chair. She had been sitting back in chairs and not writing things for longer moments over the past several days. She had been thinking about things that were not clinical and not professional, and that did not belong in the chart. She was aware of this. She was also aware that she had been in this house every day for over a month, and that the house had changed since she had arrived, and that she had changed since she had arrived, and that those 2 changes were not unrelated. She was a professional. She had been a professional for 10 years, and she had always known exactly what the boundaries of her role were, and she had always operated within them, because operating within them was correct and necessary, and because the alternative was a kind of confusion that helped no one. She had worked with difficult clients, and demanding clients and clients who were going through things that were genuinely hard, and she had maintained the right distance every time. This was different from all of those times. She picked up her phone and called Alma. Alma Ward was her closest friend and had been since nursing school, and Alma was currently running a care placement with a retired judge in Connecticut, and was the person Nadine talked to when she needed to talk to someone who would understand the specific landscape of the work she did. She told Alma she was thinking about requesting a transfer from the current placement. Alma was quiet for a moment and then asked why. Nadine started to explain. She said the client was complex, and the household had a particular dynamic that was unlike any household she had worked in before. She said there were elements to the situation that she had not anticipated when she took the placement, and that she was not sure she was managing those elements with the professional detachment the situation required. Alma let her talk. When she stopped talking, Alma asked a question. She asked Nadine what specifically would change if she transferred. She asked whether the work would be worse or the client's progress would suffer, or whether her own capacity to do her job had been actually compromised. She said these things because she knew Nadine, and she knew how Nadine thought, and she wanted to know what the actual concern was underneath the explanation. Nadine sat at the desk and did not immediately answer. Alma asked her a simpler version of the same question. She asked what the real reason was that she wanted to leave. There was a silence on the line that lasted about 15 seconds. Nadine said never mind. She said she was sorry for calling in the middle of the workday. She said she would call again at the weekend. Alma said okay. She said to take care of herself. Nadine said she would. She set the phone down on the desk and looked at the chart files in front of her. She did not call the placement agency. She finished updating the chart. She organized the session notes for the following day. She reviewed the 3-month projection she had given Vincent that morning and checked the numbers against the latest assessment results, and the numbers held. The improvement was real and it was documented, and it was going to continue if the work continued. She closed the file and put it back in the binder. She went upstairs to tell Vincent she was leaving for the day and would see him at 8. She found him in the sitting room near the window, and he was not looking out at the street. He was looking at the painting above the fireplace. The landscape with the particular light in it that she had said was both very present and already leaving. He heard her come in and looked over. She told him she was heading out, and that tomorrow's session would start with the resistance progression they had been building toward. He said he would be ready. She said good. She picked up her bag from the side table and went to the door. She stopped there for a moment, the way she sometimes did, the way that had become its own small thing between them over the weeks, a brief pause that neither of them explained because neither of them needed to. Then she went out. The house was quiet after she left in the way it had been quiet after she left every day for over a month now. But the quality of this quiet was entirely different from the quality of the quiet before she had arrived. It was not a heavy quiet. It was simply the quiet of a house that would be different in the morning, and the morning was something to look forward to. He turned back to the painting. The light in it was doing what it did, present and leaving both at once. He looked at it for a while. Then he turned toward the desk and pulled out the notebook he used for things he was thinking through, and he opened it to a new page. He sat for a long time with the pen in his hand, not writing, thinking. Then he began to write. He did not show anyone what he wrote. He simply wrote it, and when he was done, he closed the notebook and put it away. But the expression on his face when he sat back was the expression of a man who has looked at something honestly and has found that the honest looking is something he can stand. Georgie arrived on a Tuesday morning with the look he carried when the information he was bringing was not going to make the day easier. It was a specific look. Vincent had seen it perhaps a dozen times in 30 years, and he had learned to read it with precision. It was not alarm, it was not urgency in the ordinary sense. It was the quality of a man who has spent time with something that he wanted to be wrong about and has confirmed through careful checking that he was not wrong about it. He came in and sat down across from Vincent, and he said that he had something to share that they needed to go through carefully. He said that over the past 3 weeks, through several different layers of their intelligence network, he had been accumulating information about a series of conversations that Marco had been having, not through the family's channels, through a separate channel that Marco had been maintaining independently, using contacts that ran outside the normal operational structure, and that had not been disclosed to Vincent. He said the conversations were with a man named Ray Fortuno. Ray Fortuno was a contact on the cartel side of a specific supply arrangement that ran through the city's western corridor. The arrangement was a significant one, and it had been in place for 4 years. It was also an arrangement that had been carefully managed by Vincent to remain within specific parameters that both sides understood. The parameters were important because they maintained a balance that prevented the arrangement from creating dependencies that could be exploited. Marco, through his conversations with Ray Fortuno, had been discussing the possibility of expanding those parameters significantly. He had been discussing this without Vincent's knowledge. He had been discussing it as though he had the authority to restructure the arrangement, which he did not have, and he had been doing it for at least 3 weeks, possibly longer. Georgie laid out the full picture as he had assembled it, point by point, in the way he always laid out the full picture. He did not editorialize. He simply stated what the evidence showed and then stopped speaking. Vincent sat in his chair and listened to all of it without speaking. When Georgie was done, the room was quiet for about 30 seconds. Then Vincent asked how confident Georgie was in the sourcing. Georgie said he had verified through 3 independent sources and that the information from all 3 was consistent. He said he had not brought it before this morning because he had spent the previous 2 days completing the verification. He said he was confident. Vincent asked if Ray Fortuno had already committed to anything, or if the conversations were still in the proposal stage. Georgie said the most recent information suggested Fortuno had agreed to move forward in principle, but that no formal arrangement had been concluded. He said there was probably a window. He said it would be a short window. Vincent said he understood. He sat for another moment. Then he told Georgie to contact Pete Agosti and Danny Russo and 2 other specific men whose names he gave, and to have all of them in this house by Thursday at 2 in the afternoon. He said to contact Leonard Favre first, this morning, and to have Leonard prepare a summary of the relevant operational agreements, the ones governing the Western Corridor arrangement specifically, in a form that could be reviewed at the meeting. Georgie said he would do this. Vincent said one more thing. He said to reach Ray Fortuno through the appropriate channel and communicate that the current conversation needed to stop and that any future conversation on the subject would be conducted through the correct parties through the correct structure. He said to do this before Thursday so that Fortuno understood the situation before the meeting. Georgie said he understood. He stood to leave and then paused. He said there was one more thing he wanted to say. He said that what Marco had done was not a small departure from the way things operated. He said it was a specific kind of departure that had a specific name in their world, and that carried a specific set of consequences that were not negotiable. He said he wanted Vincent to know that he understood this fully, and that whatever Vincent decided to do about it, he would support and execute without hesitation. Vincent thanked him for saying that. Georgie left. The 2 days between Tuesday morning and Thursday afternoon moved with the particular quality of days that are carrying something heavy and know it. The regular sessions with Nadine continued. They were good sessions. His progress was not affected by whatever was moving through his mind during those days, or rather it was not impeded by it. If anything, he was more focused during the exercises than he had been, with the particular concentrated attention that a person brings to physical work when the mind is occupied by something that has not yet resolved. He moved through the sessions with precision, and Nadine noted the results without comment on whatever she may have observed in the quality of his focus. She did not ask him what was happening. She was not that kind of person. She observed and she kept her observations where they belonged. On Thursday, the 4 men arrived as asked. Pete first, as always, then Danny, then the other 2. Georgie met them at the door. They came into the dining room and took their places, and the table was arranged the way it was arranged for meetings of this kind. Vincent came in and positioned himself at the head. Leonard Favre was present, which told the men at the table that this was a meeting of a specific kind. Leonard presented the summary of the operational agreements. He was brief and precise, and the presentation took 12 minutes. He set the documents on the table and sat back. Then Georgie presented what he had gathered. He did it the same way he had done it for Vincent on Tuesday, without editorializing, just the picture assembled point by point until the picture was complete. The room was quiet when Georgie finished. Pete looked at the documents in front of him. He looked at Vincent. He asked one question. He asked whether the information was fully verified. Vincent said it was. Pete said he understood. He said nothing more than that. He did not need to say more than that. The men at the table understood what they had been presented with, and they understood what it meant, and they understood what it was going to require. These were people who operated inside a set of rules that were not written down anywhere, but that were as real and as binding as any document, and the rule that applied to what Marco had done was among the most clearly understood rules there was. Vincent said he was going to give them his direction. He said Marco's position in the family structure was eliminated, effective immediately. He said the operational responsibilities that Marco had carried would be redistributed through the existing structure in a way that Leonard and Georgie had already mapped out. He said all external contacts and arrangements that had run through Marco were to be reviewed and accounted for through the proper channels. He said Marco would be contacted today through Leonard, and that Leonard's communication would be final and would not be followed by any discussion. He said Marco was out of the family in all operational respects. He said the personal relationship was a separate matter and one he would manage in his own way. He said there were to be no other consequences. He said this clearly and only once. There was a brief silence. Then Pete nodded, then Danny, then the other 2. Leonard noted everything in the record he kept for these purposes. The meeting lasted 40 minutes in total. People left in the proper order, Pete last, and he stood at the door of the sitting room where Vincent had moved after the formal portion had ended, and he said that the house was in good order. He said it simply, and with the weight of a man who had watched Vincent manage a significant thing with the full authority of what he was, and who considered it a privilege to be at the table when it happened. He left. Georgie came to Vincent after everyone was gone. He said he would make the necessary communications that evening and that, by the following morning, the operational restructuring would be underway. He said Leonard's communication to Marco would go out tonight. Vincent said thank you. Georgie said he did not need thanks for doing the right thing. He left. The house was very quiet. Vincent sat in the sitting room for a long time. He did not go to the window. He stayed near the fireplace and he looked at the painting above it. The light in it was doing what it always did. Present and leaving, both things at once. He thought about Marco. He thought about 52 years and what that amount of time contained between two brothers who had chosen the same world and had stood in it together. He thought about the things Marco had done well and the things he had done poorly, and the way that the full picture of a person was always more complicated than the headline of any single decision they made. He sat with the grief of it because it was a genuine grief, and because he was not a man who pretended things were not what they were. He sat with it for a while and then he put it in the place where things that had been fully dealt with were kept, not forgotten, not denied, simply finished and held in the place where finished things lived. The next morning, Nadine arrived at 8. She came through the door the way she always came, with the same even energy and the same organized eyes and the same bag on the same shoulder. She set it on the side table and looked at him. He looked at her. He told her to sit down, not in the clinical chair, in the good chair. She looked at him for a moment, and then she sat. He said he had something he wanted to say to her. He said it was not related to the sessions or the chart or anything in the professional scope of what they were doing together. He said he wanted her to understand that from the start. She said she understood. He said he was aware that the situation of the past several weeks had not been a straightforward one. He said the household had contained things that were not normal and that she had encountered them without asking for them, and had handled everything she encountered with a quality of steadiness that he had noticed every day. He said he had observed her for over a month now, not in a clinical way, in the way that a person watches another person when they want to understand who they actually are, and he had understood a great deal. He said he wanted to ask her something. He said he wanted her to stay, not in the capacity she was currently in. He said the nursing arrangement could continue as long as she thought it needed to, and he was genuinely grateful for all of it, and he knew how much the work had meant. But what he was asking was something separate from that. He said he did not fully know what to call it yet. He said he was not a man who made speeches, as she had probably already gathered, and he was not about to make one now. He said he simply wanted her to know that she was welcome to stay in whatever way she chose, that the house would be different if she did not stay, and better if she did, and that he knew the difference between those two things and did not say either of them lightly. Then he stopped talking. She looked at him for a long moment. She had been in a number of rooms in her life where the air had held something important in it. She knew what that felt like. She knew how to sit in a room like that without hurrying what it contained. She said she had been in this house for 6 weeks. She said she had come in expecting a professional assignment with a difficult client, and she had found something that was not entirely that, and that the difference was something she had been trying to figure out what to do with for the past several weeks. She said she had not figured it out entirely, but she said she was not going anywhere. He looked at her. She looked back. The morning light came through the window the way it always did at this hour, the early autumn light that had been coming through that window since the first morning she had arrived. And the room was exactly the same room it had always been, and it was also entirely different from the room it had been before she walked into it the first time. He said he was glad. She said she was too. They began the morning session. The session was good. His numbers were better than they had been. The left hip response was consistent and sustained now in a way that had moved beyond the category of encouraging and into the category of genuinely promising. She showed him the updated projection line, revised upward from the one she had given him the week before. He looked at it for a moment. He said it was a good line. She said it was going to be a better one by spring. He said he would hold her to that. She said he was welcome to. The house ran through its ordinary morning around them. Carol moved in the kitchen. The street outside moved through its own ordinary rhythm, the delivery truck and the woman with the dog and the pigeons organizing and reorganizing on the ledge. All of it the same as it had always been, all of it also, quietly and permanently, something new. Outside, the city did what cities do. It moved. It ran on its own engine, indifferent and continuous, full of its own noise and weather and complication. Inside the sitting room of this particular house on this particular morning, two people sat together in a room that had been remade, by small things and large things, and by the particular kind of change that does not announce itself until it has already happened, into something that belonged to both of them. Neither of them said this. They did not need to. The light was good and the work was good, and the morning was full of what it always contained when the two of them were in the room together. Which was enough. Which was, after a very long time of less than enough, more than sufficient. Which was, to use the word accurately and without ceremony, everything.